Good afternoon. You know, I keep carrying on our conversation. Here's another thing to consider. I'm going to read something, and I'm going to give props. Where I pulled a lot of the information from was the Reich Wing Watch. Reich-Wing-Watch is a reel that I found. So I pulled this up. But I thought it would be interesting, as another thing to talk about. To draw parallels between the 1920s into the 30s and 40s and the 2020s into current time and whatnot. Here's what I want you to do as I'm talking about this, okay? I want you to see what the parallels are. See what the parallels are. To hear it and understand the parallels between the 30s, 20s, 30s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and right now, the 2020s. 100 years. 100 years. Apparently we haven't learned very much. So, do this. I'm not going to necessarily designate between 1920s and 30s or now. I'm just going to say the leader, okay? So, to better understand. So the leader instigated an insurrection against the government. He was tried, convicted of felonies, was given a slap on the wrist, and decried that he was the victim of political prosecution by the corrupt Social Democrats. So this leader positioned himself as a very, very much aligned with the common man. He was a man of the people, a man for the people. That's what he said. Claimed to be the people's retribution, the people's savior, and the only one who could fix all the problems going on in the country. He railed against the elites and cultural degeneracy and the establishment government, the established government of the time, labeling all of those in the established government along all echelons as Marxists, socialists, communists. He claimed that the education system was one of indoctrination from grade school through college, and that all the children were being taught to hate the country. And in that, he promised to fix the education system and promised to return the country to greatness. To solidify his base, he scapegoated minorities and immigrants as being responsible for the nation's problems. Exploiting, the societal divisions with an us versus them narrative. So many people took the bait, and the party formed and continued to gain traction over time. He appointed oligarchs as his economic advisors, privatizing government-run organizations and solidifying support of the economic elite. The working class became much more divided along cultural and ethnic lines. Workers' unions were being shut down and ignored. Strikes became illegal and eventually would result in imprisonment. Progressives and trade unionists were imprisoned and sent to concentration camps. Corporate profits skyrocketed while working class lived paycheck to paycheck. That sounds very familiar and recent. Progressives and trade unionists were, I already said that. The leader became a billionaire while in office. The current leader is already supposedly a billionaire. But the leader full and well knew that he and his sycophants of oligarchs could get away with the scam if they constantly have an enemy from within to blame as the corporatocracy robbed the country blind. Interesting. So, how do you keep doing this while the people suffer? Well, you go after the low-hanging fruit. The weakest group's the easiest to target. Birthright citizenship was taken away. In the case of the 1930s, that was predominantly Jewish people. Here it's any illegals. So people started getting rounded up for mass deportations for being in the country illegally. And instances of terrible violence by the so-called illegals were constantly being put out into the news by the press. So for the sake of keeping the country safe, these people must be gotten rid of, must be deported. And where deportations weren't able to be accommodated, they were simply moved into concentration camps. So the press seemed to be easily intimidated, easily intimidated into not questioning the leadership's changes and means of execution of orders, or the new laws being implemented. Anyone who opposed anything that the government was doing was called the enemy, and Marxist, socialist, communists. Soon, the media didn't have any will to stand up and call out the wrongs or question the administration. They simply reported what was happening with a party line support. There's actually plenty of newspapers from the 1930s talking about concentration camps, talking about deportations, talking about people being rounded up and where across the country. This was not unknown to the German people. They were aware of it if they read the papers, and back then, everybody read the papers. Under this leadership, democratic institutions began being infiltrated by non-elected peoples, where typically an elected person would be head of that organization or part of the administration. They were being removed for non-elected people. Programs and functions of the government were halted, and the funds for these programs stopped and appropriated by the leadership for other things, even though through constitutional law, that was not how the government operated. The leader could not make these changes without the legislation agreeing and changing the laws, and the courts ruled against these actions, but then were ignored, and judges were arrested as being enemies of the state. In quick order, attention was directed towards education and learning. Books that were promoting degeneracy were banned, collected, and eventually burned. Authors such as Ernest Hemingway, Sigmund Freud, Helen Keller, Jack London, H.G. Wells, frickin' Einstein, and of course Karl Marx. These authors, their books, and books like it, were rounded up. These were people of thought, people who talked about class consciousness, sexuality, romance, women's rights. All of these things were gathered up as being degenerate, as being not conducive for the mental health of the people, and were burned. Massive book burnings. Where there was thriving LGBTQ communities and transgender inclusion, such places and spaces were banned initially and then burned. In fact, one of the first major book burnings took place in front of an LGBTQ hospital center. I'm not sure if it was a hospital, might have been associated in that region, that area of that town with it, but it was in front of an LGBTQ center. So the LGBTQI+ communities were forced back in hiding. All references to this community were erased across all government documents, and the proper family designation of male married to female were the only acceptable concepts. Many LGBTQI were forced to identify themselves with pink upside-down triangle badges. Eventually, anyone identified or accused were sent to concentration camps. If you were somebody back in the 1930s in Germany who was a political dissident, that was a different color triangle badge. Who was also gay, that was also a different color triangle badge. Who was also Jewish, you had to wear all three, and they rotated them so that they could see all three colors. They were all very distinct colors. There were other badges for others so that they could be easily identified just by the color on their chest. So, eventually, anyone who was identified or accused of being gay was eventually just sent to the concentration camps. They were grabbed from the back of a van or the back of a truck and deported to these camps. So manhood was an important thing to the leadership here. What makes a man? The ideology behind manhood, masculinity. So it was very important to be a strong man, both to the leader to be seen as a strong man, and for the understanding of what a strong man actually looked like. So strong women, independent women who did not rely on men for their support or well-being, were stealing power from men and skewing the proper social functions of womanhood. The leader proclaimed, at the same time he defined man and woman, that a man's world is her husband, her family, her children, her house. Women's rights were stripped from them, abortion was outlawed, and doctors who performed them, regardless of why they needed to be performed, were faced with the death penalty. Access to women's healthcare and reproductive rights were repealed. Everything that I'm saying is not just something that could possibly happen or has been happening today. It was something that definitely happened in the 1930s Germany. That's what I want you to understand here. This is not new. This is history repeating itself in the United States, where we were the ones who effectively fought against this in Germany. During all this time, people knew what was happening and that it felt wrong. It felt extreme. It was frightening. Some people were very much for the changes and the absolute control. They liked that happening because they either benefited from it or it felt comfortable and comforting to them. Some were so supportive that they joined the party and then joined the military or the militias. For everyone else, the choice was to either join in some capacity or to fight against it. So they either joined and you went to the rallies and you cheered, all of that, or you were against it and you were quiet. And maybe you stood there watching, or you simply didn't go at all and hoped that nobody noticed that you weren't there. So the majority joined in small ways and big ways. They reported people for the authorities. They fed soldiers and police. They worked where they were told to and refused service to people they were told to refuse service to. They watched as people were rounded up. They watched as they were shot. Then they either froze in fear, ran away, or hid, or cheered it on. So the parallels should be your clue, even if you're not really big into history. Not having this narrative, be very interesting to see if this kind of a narrative would be attempted to be erased or not talked about. If somehow, in some way, this could really go that far here. The one thing that the Germans didn't have was historical context. We have historical context. Now, the difference is that the historical context of 100 years ago is not the same as the historical context that the Germans actually did kind of sort of have, which was the historical context of, let's say, the Romans coming in. That's historical commons. Romans came in. Usually it's an invasion from an outside force that forces everything. And what we don't need to ignore is the fact that Germans were not a dumb people. What they did was act stupidly. What they did was freeze. What many of them could have done was turn around, link arms in huge communities around the people that were being rounded up and tell the soldiers, you will have to shoot us too. And then see what the public's reaction could be. I've seen neighbors, and I think it was in Tennessee, come surround a vehicle within a community because ICE had come up to grab these folks. And this neighborhood knew this family. They enjoyed this family. They were good people, people who worked hard. Everybody in the household worked. The kids went to the schools. And they didn't think it was right what ICE was doing because ICE didn't have the force of law behind it. Now, we can argue about certain things, but there's a right way, even in having the law be obeyed. But here's the thing. You cannot demand that the law be obeyed while you are in the action of disobeying the law. Saying that we're going to ignore that was agreed upon and put into force because we don't like it anymore doesn't make sense. It's rewriting it in your favor. Kings do that shit. Dictators do that shit. Law-abiding citizens and presidents do not do that shit. So the choice is fast becoming, because there are parallels there. In some cases, I'm talking about a 1923 was when Hitler instigated an insurrection that failed. Hitler had spent time in jail. He did get jailed, but it wasn't for very long. That was what was considered a slap on the wrist, because he held such sway, or because the country was starting to get its feet back under it after World War I, and was trying to do things the right way. Because nobody thought it would go to that extreme. People may not think it would go to that extreme, even while laws are being ignored and new laws are being implemented that then have to be followed by the people that strip away the individual's rights. You cannot feel like you're free while you're watching other people be oppressed. Even though you might intellectually understand that they're saying there's a difference there. There's not a difference. Because it doesn't take much for you to then be the person who then is being oppressed. Because that changes on a dime at the whim of someone who generally isn't mentally stable, much less emotionally stable. If you cannot see the parallels here, that in the movies about Germany, people taking over other people's homes, their collections of art, how the rich people were also abused because something could be found at fault with them. And the leader, the dear leader, needed money, so he was going to take your money. You weren't worthy of the things that you worked hard to get, because he determined you weren't worthy. If you don't want to live like that, then you need to pay attention, and you need to link arms with others and stand up and say, no, those ICE agents left. They didn't have the law on their side. Period. And we are hard trying to figure out a consequence for disobeying the law as written. For those who are currently in power, who think they are above the law. Here's one thing that is really, really important. I'm going to repeat it. There are more of us than there are of them, and there always have been. Even in Germany, there was far more of them than there were of the Nazis. in America, there is far more of the general population who doesn't want shit to go in this direction than the assholes who think that they do. We far exceed the stupid numbers of stupid people who think they can just run over the rest of us. I am not interested in the American version of a rehashing of fascism or authoritarianism or Christian nationality. No, thank you. These things have been rejected in various ways, time and time again. Now they're asking for an even harder rejection. Okay. Bet.